You know, they spent 400 plus years in Egypt. The question we never ask is why? Why did God want his people in Egypt? To make them bigger, to make them more, to increase the population of his people. Egypt was the place to do that for several reasons. One is food, because Egypt had the food. Especially then, they had the famine, but all the time, Egypt had a steady supply of food other than those famine years along the Nile River. And the most fertile place was the Nile Delta, and they raised a lot of food. It was the prime spot, exactly where God's people ended up moving to, the Nile Delta. So they had plentiful supply of food. They had shelter, permanent housing. They moved from tents into a house. And everybody would say, amen, yeah. How many of you have been in a tent? Yeah. How many of you really enjoyed it? I never get hands go up on that one. But they also had protection, because this was Egypt, the most powerful country in the world at the time. Excuse me. Nobody really messed with Egypt. They were all afraid of it. So if they were in Egypt, they are safe, they're secure, they're protected. And of course, later Joseph is in charge and the protection just increases. So they've got everything they need so that they can increase the population. And the question always is, well, how many did they start with? And of course, the later question that people have been arguing about for years, and it goes anywhere from a few thousand to millions, how many came out during the Exodus. So we're going to look at that real quickly. How many went in? Because this really matters. In Genesis 46, verses 26 and 27, it says, all the persons belonging to Jacob, this is on your handout, all the verses are, who came into Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70. So how are we going to figure out? So I just did a little guesswork and some figuring, and if there's 70 people, and he's got 12 sons, and they had 12 wives at least, so that makes it 82, but they had a few more wives. So I just picked the number 90. That's a good number. You can pick another number, but it's going to have to be around 100 or less, because it lists everybody in there, and you can read those verses. It lists everybody by name, all the males. How many daughters there were, we don't really know, and how many wives they had, you can figure that out, kind of, sort of. So I was just being kind of conservative, didn't want to go overboard, so I picked the number of 90. That's a good number. How many people left in the Exodus? So this is how I figured this. Again, I went really conservative on this. So if they had 2% growth compounded annually. Barbara's looking at me. She knows what that means. So yeah, how I did this was I found a mortgage compound calculator. That's the easiest way to do it. And compound annually. So if you compound 90 people at 2% growth, compounded annually for 400 years, it comes out to 243,920. It all depends on how much they started with and how fast they grew. I'm going to say chances are it was probably more people than that, maybe a good many more people than that, because they had food, shelter, protection, everything that they needed to grow. And they probably eventually grew at a faster rate than 2%. 400 years is a long time. So, God took his people to Egypt in order for them to increase their population quicker than they could have out in the boonies. And do remember that God planned this all along. It's in Genesis 15:13. Before any of these people existed, God is talking to Abram before he's even Abraham. And he says, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. There it is. God knew it, and he's going to take advantage of it. There it is. This is the way it's going to happen. They're going to Egypt so that his population of his people can grow. The next question is, how in the world is God going to get them there? Because this is a huge culture change from being a nomad to being in a permanent agricultural setting. It's a huge cultural change because you go from the freedom of doing what you wanted out in the boonies to now you have to do what Pharaoh says or what somebody said Pharaoh said. And then you have to account for neighbors because, they lived there, it was their family, and they couldn't see anybody else. I had a secretary that many years ago, she came in all upset one day for work. And she lived out in the country, and I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "Well, I told you those people bought that property next to ours." Yeah, she wasn't happy about that either. And she says, "Now they're building a house, and we can see it from our house." I had a good laugh about that one. She didn't appreciate that, but, there are things you have to get used to, like neighbors. Then they had all of these other gods they have to get used to, though they probably knew about them. And then there's going to be pressure to assimilate, and when you're in Egypt, you should act like an Egyptian, right? Yeah, so all of this is going on. How in the world is God going to get them there? And that's where the famine comes in. Famine. We are so accustomed to having the food that we want. It might cost more. But in the wintertime, think about it. In the wintertime, we can have all of these wonderful summertime foods. Tomatoes, corn, whatever it is, cantaloupe, watermelon, and it comes from all over the world to our supermarkets. In fact, if you go into some of the big cities and ask kids where their food comes from, they're all going to say like Walmart or Brookshire's or something because they don't know. They've never seen a cow even. So my goodness. So we have kind of a hard time with this concept. Their food came from what they had. So they're wandering around with sheep. Their meat came from sheep, and the sheep food came from the ground. And if all of that grass dried up, all their sheep started dying, then their food was gone. If they couldn't gather all of the food that they needed because of the famine, then their food was gone. Famine was a life or death situation. Absolutely. It brought fear for the future like nothing else. If we don't do something, truly they were going to die. Egypt is that something that they're going to do. In fact, it's the only something that is available because God made sure that Egypt had food. How is God going to get his people accepted into a prime place for growth? Joseph, the man who saved Egypt, the hero for all that area of the world, Joseph. So the question becomes, how can God make Joseph the person he needs to be to accomplish God's purpose? And this is Joseph's story. Making Joseph into the man he needs to be to accomplish God's purpose. The culmination of this story is in Genesis 50, verse 21, when he's meeting with his brothers and he says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. It's a huge difference from the man who started, or the young man who started. So we talk about Joseph's start, and the whole story starts in chapter 37 of Genesis. And we find out a little bit about Joseph right away. If you read verse 2, you find out that he was 17 years old and he was a tattletale. Who likes a tattletale? No one. Not even teachers like tattletales. So he was a 17-year-old telling on his brothers. In verse 3, you find out he's daddy's favorite. Absolutely his favorite. And I find it a little bit understandable. It says he was born in Isaac's old age, Jacob's old age. He was Rachel's oldest son. Now you have to go back and remember the story, because Jacob ran from Esau and went to Laban, and he worked 7 years. Laban promised him after 7 years he could marry Rachel. And of course, what a surprise wedding. He married Leah instead. Really makes me wonder about their ritual ceremonies. So he worked 7 more years. I mean, he loved Rachel. 14 years he worked for Rachel to be his wife. And now Rachel, she couldn't have kids. Leah's birthing kids right and left. Rachel's got none. She feels terrible. Jacob feels terrible for her. Nothing's happening. Oh, and then God visits her and she has Joseph, the oldest son of his favorite wife. Daddy's favorite. Buys him the coat of many colors. And Joseph is already hated by everybody else in the family. And then he has dreams. He has dreams about sheaves of wheat. Yes, and they're bowing down to him. And he told that dream to all his brothers. And I can just see the smug look on his face while he's telling that story. I've known people like that. They hated him even more. Joseph is his own worst enemy. Then he has another dream. This is in verses 9 through 11. That the sun and the moon, mom and dad, and 11 stars, 11 brothers, are going to bow down to him. I mean, they're so mad at him. Even Jacob got on to him about this one. When you read all of this and put it together, the brothers are a little more understandable. Now, there's no excuse for what they did, but it's a little more understandable. And I've got a little picture there for you. My brother's last nerve. I want to touch it. Wow. You know, we've got 2 grandsons. They're 20 months apart. And this describes them perfectly. They love each other. But they know every button to push to make the other one mad. And there's nothing they enjoy more in life than pushing that button over and over and over again. And in case it's quiet at home, they'll push it again. Joseph just took it to extremes. Way to extremes. He was the most favored, the most spoiled, the most bratty. And he's a teenager. I mean, by 17, should be carrying big responsibilities. You can kind of understand the family situation a little better. So he went from this most favored position to slavery. Now that's a culture shock. But he was there for a reason, because Joseph at 17, we don't know how many years transpired in this, but 17, 18, 19, was not a person who God could use to accomplish his purpose. He had to change. So Joseph's first transformation was one of humility. From most favored position to slave. That's a hard lesson. It doesn't matter who you are. We have words that go with humility, like humiliating or humiliated. And those are negative words. Humility is a good word. But sometimes the only way you learn humility is to be humiliated. A hard lesson. And the bigger the ego, and Joseph evidently had a big one, the harder the lesson. And then you throw in the fact that his own brothers were going to kill him. But they chose to make a little money off of him instead and sold him into slavery. What goes through your mind? Why me? I didn't deserve this. And you just have to imagine the anger, the bitterness, the hate that grew for his brothers. It's natural. He wasn't an unnatural person, not a superhero. He's just like us. Well, actually, I hope you weren't like that when you were a teenager. He's like us. So somewhere in these moments of slavery, years of slavery, we don't know how long it lasted. We don't know how old he was when he finally went to prison. But somewhere in there, he learned submission. I mean, he had to learn submission to human masters to survive. But we'll have to imagine that because there's no record, there's no explanation, there's no timeline. We just kind of have to imagine I can imagine from stories I've heard of slavery, it was not easy. And somewhere in those years, there's no record, he learned submission to God. Because he learns that God is responsible for his blessings. Genesis 39, 2 through 5. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master, Potiphar. His master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. Somewhere Joseph learned and recognized that the good things that he was finding, even while a slave, came from God. Because Joseph had to tell this part of the story. There was no one there to watch and write it down. There was no one there to discuss it with. He had no family. He had no fellow Jews. Joseph had to tell this story, so Joseph understood that all of this was from God. What a powerful transformation. What a hard way to go about it. Joseph's second transformation, I call it choosing righteousness, and this is about Potiphar's wife. It's in chapter 39. And when you read this, there's got to be more to this story, because that'd make a really good soap opera. There was some flirting ahead of time, and it just didn't explode all at once. She worked on it for a while, and this was the big part of the story. I think it unfolded probably slow enough so that Joseph had time to consider all of the possibilities. Because if he had this affair with Potiphar's wife, Potiphar would find out for sure, because Joseph is now the head guy over all the slaves. They get a little upset with him. They just whisper to Potiphar, hey, Joseph's sleeping with your wife. Those kind of politics go on all the time. And Joseph's dead. Not only that, if he does this thing, then she's going to hold that over his head all the time, and he's going to have to do whatever she says. Wrong choices often have multiple negative consequences. Right choices can also have consequences. To keep up with a lot of the news, there was a retired pastor in North Ireland that was convicted this last week, arrested and convicted because he was preaching John 3:16. He was just doing it too close to an abortion center. Heard some reports from China. This has been many years ago. They were sending missionaries. Chinese Christians sending missionaries. Imagine that. Because, it's illegal for most of them to meet. And then they told us that they don't even consider you a real mature Christian ready to be sent as a missionary unless you spent time in prison for your faith. Right choices can have consequences. I think Joseph had some time to compare the consequences, and he chose righteousness. And sometimes you choose righteousness in spite of the circumstances. Now, things we don't know where Joseph figured this out or how he learned right from wrong. He's a solo act in a slavery situation. There is no law. God hasn't given it yet. He has no instruction. There's lots of negative influences. There's lots of other gods, and there's lots of guys whispering in his ears, why don't you, why don't you? But it's somewhere in this place, Joseph learned a relationship with God. And we don't know how. But somehow he got it. And that's the point of the story, is he learned, he changed, he transformed. And it was a hard way to go to get there. But he started off with a lot of work to do. Joseph's third transformation involves a new gift from God. You have to remember he's in prison. Genesis 39:20. Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Now, when we read that, we have to remember this is not an American prison. This was a bad place. This was a terrible place. And you can take all of the bad stories you might have heard about prisons in the third world countries, and that's this more like it. But he's not dead. So he's escaped death twice. He escaped it in the pit. He got sold into slavery. And now he's escaped it with Potiphar and his wife. I've heard many people say that they learn the hard way. And I always look at them and say, well, that's really not something to be proud of. Pay attention to God and learn from Him and follow Him. Joseph had lessons to learn. But he's in prison, and again, he does quite well. For being in prison, he does exceptionally well. He goes from slavery to being in charge of Potiphar's house. He goes from prison to be in charge of the prison. And one thing I've never heard is that this is leadership training. Because when Joseph gets out, he's going to Pharaoh next. So when Joseph gets out, he's had 2 long-term experiences of leading people, managing things, and making things run. Leadership. God has a plan. And we need to be in that plan. At the lowest part of life, we need to be in that plan. Romans 8:28-29. All things work together for good. That's where the world stops, right? And the world's got it wrong, because the rest of it makes it clear for who. All things work together for good to those who love the Lord, who are called according to His purpose, which is to transform us into the image of His Son. Remember that God has a plan, He has a purpose, and it's best for you to be in it, not fighting it. God's plan was Egypt. Now you meet the strangest people in prison, people who didn't plan to be there. In fact, I could tell you a story or two, not from residents, but from prison ministry. There, he met 2 people, the cupbearer to the king, to Pharaoh. This was one of the most highly trusted positions in the kingdom. He was testing everything to make sure it didn't kill the Pharaoh. Huge amounts of trust. Kings often talked to their cupbearers for counsel. He met the baker. Trust. He wasn't going to poison the food. Now, it doesn't really matter why they were in prison. These two guys fit into God's plan. It still matters who you know, and God has to take Joseph from prison to an audience with Pharaoh to make this work. So he gives Joseph the gift of dream interpretation. That's a new one. And he interpreted the dream for the cupbearer, and it was a good one. And he interpreted the dream for the baker, and he told him, you're going to die, and he did. And the cupbearer was going to be restored, and he was. And Joseph said, remember me. Well, the cupbearer forgot. It's happened to you, I know. It just wasn't the right time. It went on for a while. It's hard to wait on God. Abraham spent 25 years, you remember? It's hard to wait. So Pharaoh had a dream. And suddenly the cupbearer remembers because it's time. Joseph interprets the dream, and all along he gives credit to God. He's learned a lot. And as a result of interpreting that dream and standing there before Pharaoh, he goes from slavery to prison to being second in charge to the whole country. Wow. That's a promotion. From spoiled brat to vice pharaoh. Loved and respected, saving people, a hero. But it was a long way there. God has a plan. And to accomplish that plan, Joseph has become the person he needs to be. And he stands before Pharaoh, and he gets this tremendously important job. God finishes this part of his plan. It begins in chapter 42, using the famine. Joseph's family needed something to eat. Jacob's family needed something to eat, a life and death choice. There's lots of drama in these chapters. It's a good read. There's lots of drama, played out over months. Now, Joseph is very different from who he was, but I'm going to tell you, forgiveness is hard, and grace isn't cheap. He had a lot to think about. Time to realize that God had a plan, and we can do that better in hindsight. Time to come to grips with just what exactly forgiveness is and what grace is. So he reveals himself to his brothers, and he moves his family to Egypt. And then notice, Genesis 47, 5 and 6. Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. In other words, welcome, and whatever I've got is yours. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen, which was the best place. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. They all got promoted. And they prospered, and they multiplied. God has a plan. It's summed up in Genesis 50, 19, 21, or 20 and 21. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many should be kept alive, God's people especially. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. God's people can grow. So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. God had a plan. Now, it required a lot of Joseph. I mean, it was tough years. No, made no mistake. But the reward was pretty good, pretty sweet. God has a plan. It's hard sometimes. It's not always hard, but sometimes it is. But it is always worthwhile to follow God's plan. And in following God's plan, we're going to recognize that God is shaping who we are. He's shaping who we are as a church, too. And God's plan for us is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And He can use everything, all things, to work together for our good, which is changing us into the image of His Son. God has a plan. Joseph learned the hard way. Let's choose the easy way. And John's going to come lead us in prayer now.